Hello, hello. We're waiting just for the stream to start. We don't exist till the stream starts. And after the stream ends, we we cease to exist again. No, this is a meditation practice, but I can understand if you're not sensitive to that. Well, okay. So, what we're trying to do, so we watched these 3 videos, and we had a talk from Heather this morning, and we have had lots of engagement. So what we try, I'm sitting here, but actually, what I'm trying to do, although I will, let me start with the right priority. What I hope is we can have an exchange about the various things that we saw, the videos, and everything that happened so far, and I will just attempt to bring some kind of, not moderation, but more like facilitation. And besides that, I just would like to say that in the morning, I kept bringing the microphone to everybody, but then I realized, well, I have also want to say something, so sometimes I will interject. So I will take my own role also. So, okay, we saw 3 videos. There was one of Krishnamurti, one of Hans Rosling, the statistician, and then one by Tom, I think? Tom Chi, yeah. Good. So, whoever wants to start, I have, maybe this is the microphone we can pass around, and whoever wishes to, like particularly, he's always fine in starting. No, I don't. You kick it up. Oh, the line.
If I'm listening to a spiritual talk, like for example, Krishnaji in the first video, then I'm finding myself trying to interpret the words, maybe because I'm not familiar enough with what he's saying. Instead of opposing the ideas or questioning them, I'm finding myself trying to interpret the words to conform to whatever I believe is right, or instead of a conflicting approach, trying to reinterpret them. And then in the last Tom Chi video, he was talking about how individuals who seem like just a speck of existence in the vast galaxy, through their choices can make a difference if a bacterium did the similar thing. And this, at least on superficial level, stands in contrast with some of the other thoughts that are expressed, which is the free will and us making a difference is far less pertinent. It is the circumstances that cause change, and we're just a pawn in the big game. So I'm just saying that with all these apparently conflicting thoughts, it's possible that at least part of it is just play of words, and that if you take the right perspective, things are not that conflicting any longer. For example, some of the developmental processes concept seem to stand in direct contrast with the philosophy, to the point of people being disturbed in even acknowledging them. And again, I think there may not be that much of a conflict if you just interpret them in the right light. That's all I have to say.
Hello. I had a comment to make about what Prateek had mentioned before we did the videos pre-lunch, actually, and hope that's okay. But he had mentioned about how change evolutionarily seems to always come from external pressures in the environment, which is what brings about the change. And I felt like that was not in my personal experience, that doesn't seem to be in contradiction to what seems to happen with inquiry as well. As individuals, as human beings, we seem to be the most vulnerable to inquiry, self-inquiry, when there's a crisis in our life. A long tail event happens in our life that we had never anticipated. Could be a death, could be a divorce, could be something else, you know, and that suddenly sort of drives the daylights out of you, I suppose that's the phrase. And you realize that you don't really have any control over the external circumstance anymore, and you have no choice but to look inwardly. So to me, and I know, I don't know, but if you were to take a show of hands here in this room, perhaps half the hands, I speculate half the hands will go up to say it was a crisis in one's life, a kind of a driver to look inward when they first started their inquiry at some point in their life. So yeah, I mean, that was just, so I felt like it seems to be the same dynamic. The impetus always seems to be a crisis on the outside, not dissimilar to what seems to happen in an evolutionary context. Thank you.
So during the conversation this morning, and also a little bit yesterday afternoon, I was wondering and trying to connect what is the relationship between the themes we were discussing and, you know, Krishnamurti philosophy. How do they fit together? It wasn't entirely clear to me what was the relationship. And I'm still not sure, frankly, but I would just like to suggest one possibility. I think it's already been kind of stated or referred to, but I'll try to bring it out with a little bit more clarity. And you could ask, you know, looking at Krishnamurti's philosophy in the context of what we know about evolution in general and human evolution in particular, I think, tentatively, that Krishnamurti might agree with the proposition that humanity, over the course of the last, say, 100,000 years, 200,000 years, developed this extraordinary capacity for abstraction, symbolization, language, memory, and thought. And that must have developed over quite a period of time. I think there's some evidence that even some of the more advanced primates, chimpanzees, do certain vocalizations which seem like pre-language. But in the case of human beings, insofar as I understand it, there was something which occurred relatively recently in an evolutionary context. As I understand it, roughly 30,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago, that evolutionary biologists call the cognitive revolution, at which time apparently this capacity for abstraction, symbolization, which is thought, perhaps accelerated somewhat, maybe, I don't know, crystallized or took a quantum leap in its development. And Krishnamurti maintains that our consciousness is, that the dominant element in our consciousness is thought. He says we have enthroned thought, and he raises the question whether that is the point at which mankind took a wrong turn when that occurred. And it would seem, if you look at it in an evolutionary context, that the capacity for abstraction, symbolization, thinking, which enabled anticipation of the future, memory of the past, and so on, clearly had a terrific, incalculable, positive, beneficial, constructive effect on man's ability to dominate his environment. But it would seem that Krishnamurti might maintain that a byproduct of this extraordinary new human capacity that developed through evolutionary time, a byproduct was the failure fully to understand this new capacity, failure fully to understand the nature of thought, the meaning of thought, the function of thought. And that's where humanity took a wrong turn, and that's where, it seems to me, to quite a large extent, his philosophy revolves around the many, many, many manifestations of the difficulties, problems, conflicts, illusions that arise from the misuse of this incredibly valuable tool that we call thought, the misuse of it because consciousness has not fully understood the nature and meaning of that extraordinary new tool that we have. And so that's my best guess or ability to try to construe Krishnamurti philosophy in the context of all the other biological and evolutionary things that we've been discussing. So I just wanted to share that.
So just a question for clarification. Would you mind spending a little bit of time trying to explain what either you mean or what you think Krishnamurti means? It doesn't matter. The term thought, we use it all the time, but I'm not sure. I honestly, personally, I'm not clear that I know what thought is. So what is it? What are the boundaries? What is it not? I really think it would be useful personally to spend time on the question of what is thought before considering things like, what thought does and doesn't do and so on. Because if we're not on the same page there, then we're not discussing the same content matter. So what is thought and what is it not in terms of, let's say, brain processes? So the brain does lots of things, or lots of things happen in the brain, whichever way one wants to put it. And which of those is represented by the term thought, and what are some examples of things the brain does that are not thought, just so that we can get some clarity.
So, right. So, yeah, that's a good question, and that's why I didn't just, in my description, I tried not to just leap into that word thought, but preface it by saying what we're talking about is the capacity to symbolize, the capacity to make an abstraction. Krishnamurti, when he wants to give a shorthand introduction to his use of the word thought, he just refers to, he says the use of the word word, or any word is a form of thought, any symbolization, any picture, any image, anything of that nature it is an abstraction which represents something from the past. Therefore, thought is a symbol, it's an image, it's an abstraction which contains, in some sense, the past, and therefore it is identified, at least in Krishnamurti's teachings, with memory, with knowledge. And that which is not thought is that capacity that we have to be in. Thought is the past, thought is memory, thought is knowledge, thought is the past. And so I don't know what to say, the mental instruments that we have to apprehend the present, awareness, observation, perception, insight, those are the things which are not thought. Jaap, why don't you supplement this? I don't want to. You're very good with the teachings also.
Well, I can. I mean, if I look at one line that immediately comes to mind is thought is the response of memory, and the second line is it's the net. No. Thought, a line from Krishnamurti, and that's yes. Thought is the response of memory, and the second line is it's the network of thought. And how I put those things together is that there are two things. First, there's a brain as a blueprint of how it's functioning, how our brain is storing knowledges, and how the brain is recalling knowledge. And then it's important what kind of knowledge is in there. And one, and that's actually interesting because I don't think that the knowledge is stored, and we somehow have to keep it simple because the more you look at neurology, the more complex it becomes. So if we look at it on a layman level, storage is stored in a certain way, but it's not uniformly stored. It's stored with certain priority. I mean, dangerous things are stored differently than other things, and pleasure is stored. I mean, there's a priority to pleasurable things, and pain and pleasure, like and dislike. Then, what I understand, I'm just going to recall because how I understand Krishnamurti, so that thought is a movement. It's not like okay, now you're asking me what is your name, Jaap, and then okay, from standby mode I go into active mode, and then I recall my name, and then I shut down again. It's like there's an ongoing response of memory to the situation, to stimuli, to auto-stimuli from its own thoughts, if I'm worried about what I'm thinking, or from external stimuli. Now, and somehow in this network of how it's stored and how that network is recalling itself, you have a phenomena which we call self, and that is just some kind of hierarchy of prioritization, or some kind of organization within thought that has, for certain reason, decided or has organized itself in a way that that there's a sense of self, and it remembers that it's has also a collection of memories around what the self is and what it is not, and where it starts and where it stops. And I think there's also, I mean, I read a few things about it, that's not even constant. I mean, we perceive ourselves as a constant self, but if that is over time, you write different things, and actually if you compare that actually there's quite a bit of change happening in that set of knowledge that you call self and that you recall as that's what is me, and that is different from 10 years ago to what you are now. So thought would be the generalized name of the response of memory in an ongoing way, and maybe the attribution in that, I mean, that's where Krishnamurti then specifically also talks about, that within thought there's also a kind of idea. It is an idea. Now, another thought has been crept in where it starts to divide. This is what you call I am thinking, and I am thinking about that. So the me perspective and the other perspective. So I think that would summarize how I would clarify what thought is. Yeah.
So 2 questions and 1 point. The 2 questions are, can there be thought that doesn't come from a memory, because there isn't a memory about something, but I'm still trying to think about something, but I don't have access to memory because either my memory is gone, it's lost, I'm developing Alzheimer's, or there isn't anything to access because I'm thinking about something that I don't have any memory about. That's one question. The second, so is that still thought, or are you going to give it a different word, or are you going to say that that process simply doesn't happen? Let me just finish the questions. The second is, since animals, I mean, since David mentioned that the capacity for abstraction and conceptualization and so on is many orders of magnitude more, it appears, in humans than others, it's obviously clear that animals have memory, well, so do plants actually. And so then when actions emerge from those memories by those animals or plants, is that done through the medium of thinking, or you're going to give it a different word and not call it thought because it's not?
I personally, I cannot answer any of those two questions, but maybe David
But let
wants
me
to-
finish the third, which is the comment, which is that the greatest amount of memory, if you just measure it by content, that all of us contain and all life contains, has nothing to do with a brain. In fact, a brain is a very recent thing evolutionarily. The memory of all that has preceded us in terms of the ability to synthesize proteins in what context and what were the recipes, the history of that entire thing for how long is it, 4.5 billion years ago, that entire memory is carried by each of us and has nothing whatsoever to do with the brain. That's carried in our DNA. That in fact is DNA. DNA base pair sequence is nothing but information, and it is a specific subset of information that carries in it the sequences to synthesize proteins that all of life, from the beginning of life till today, has had on a continuum. I'm not saying it all that well, but it's basically information, it's memory, it's selective memory, it's about something. It's not about which a solar system happened when, or which supernova collided with which one, despite the link to iron. That is not contained in DNA. But DNA is a very selective thing. So, and that is the vast majority of memory that all life has and continues to accrue, and that which a brain has, which is, it's really quite small in amount, and so anyway, that's the comment.
So I don't know about those things very much. You know, I would allow, I would guess from my observations of animals that, and from my thinking about them, animals are so, interesting and precious, and so totally underestimated their capacities, their sensitivities are so profoundly underestimated and have been by human beings for so many years, including by science. But so my personal opinions about what animals can do probably is not entirely in line with at least professional biological thinking, but I would allow that animals have some primitive form of what you might call thought, but it is so rudimentary compared to what human beings have developed that it does not seem to have issued forth in all of the tremendous problems that we have as a consequence of thought. And with respect to memory, I'm sure you can make the case that the information contained in the DNA, contains, it contains literally billions of years of information, and in that sense, that form of memory, of course, exceeds the kind of memory that we are referring to in this conversation. The kind of memory that we're referring to in this conversation is that memory which is accessible to my conscious awareness, which, as Jaap was pointing out, has largely to do with my sense of myself, my sense of my personal history since I was born, and you can use the word memory if you like for what is contained in the DNA, but I would prefer to find some other word, I'm not sure what, but to just, even if it's a little bit arbitrary, reserve the word memory for what is accessible to my conscious awareness, which is mostly that which has happened to me in my life since I was born.
So now you qualified two things from the previous statement. We're not trying to fight. At least I'm not, and I know you're not. So now you introduced a qualifier, which is you're not saying all thought, but you're saying certain kind of thought of a certain degree of sophistication, because you're sort of allowing that there's a quote-unquote primitive thought. So then the problem might not be with the phenomenon of thought, but the degree of sophistication of thought, where this wrong turn business, if one wants to ask that question. The second is still somewhat of an issue. You're really not sort of qualifying memory. Let's not say you and me. So the proposition is, it may not be all memory, but it may be memory that's accessible, consciously accessible. And that kind of, the difficulties with that, one, a lot of things that happen are not consciously accessible. That threshold changes. At certain times things are accessible, and at some other times they're not accessible. So it's not clear that this piece of information always is accessible to me and this isn't. And the third is that a lot of it gets lost with age and other things. So surely we're not speculating that somehow there's a window for, or a possibility for, more awareness because memory is going. So thought can't access it because it's actually going, it's being lost. Someone who has very advanced Alzheimer's, one typically doesn't think of that as someone having a potential for a lot of freedom, in that her or his thoughts, if any, are not coming from memory. And hey, you've got Alzheimer's, great, now you've got an opportunity for developing some fantastic awareness without this interference of this dreadful thing called thought. You see, there's a lot of problems with that, and
No? No. Okay. So this is just responding to what these two gentlemen were just talking about, and my personal experience with animals. And this is kind of like an expansive view of thought, in that it's about shared thought. So my working with animals, and equine horses in particular, I've found that particularly with children with learning disabilities and adults who either seem to have difficulty with thought or just making connection in, like the usual way, just being in the presence sometimes of these quadrupeds, and dogs and cats can have a similar thing, but particularly I've found working with the horses and people that that thoughts that might not have come to these people, or maybe it's even their emotions, for them to connect to those emotions, for them to become accessible, seems to happen sometimes in that connection between animal and person. So that's just my ideas on that.
Is there an answer for that? No? Okay. I just go ahead with, because I think it has to do with what you are discussing and what Heather said in the morning about regulation. So again, worried a lot about in which direction as a society we are going and what are the problems that we are facing, and if at some point we are able to stop it or not. Heather mentioned the word regulation, which I agree with deeply. However, in the first question back that came to mind was, is this regulation has to happen, of course, in a technological and scientific level, but is this has to happen also inside each of us, in terms of our thoughts, our consciousness, and if so, how can we do that regulation? So it's like a open question that I have, if somebody has thoughts on that.
This feels like a trap. I'm kidding. I don't think I do either. It is. I think. Well, one thing that's true about language is that when we try to define terms that we use most often we find that we don't actually have even personal, much less shared definitions for many of those terms. That doesn't inherently mean that the categories are not useful, but it also doesn't necessarily mean, I would say, that we need. In some cases, we need a definition to move forward, but in some cases, perhaps we don't. So maybe I was going to pick up on what you and David were doing before a little bit, although I think it's relevant to the last two comments as well. I think at our peril, we imagine that which makes us unique is that which is conscious. And at our peril, we imagine that everything that is important should be conscious. That much of what, and I would agree with the sort of pushback against, okay, our DNA, something around 4.5 billion years ago, emerges. Does that really count as memory? It's history, but is it memory? But there's a lot in what I think probably everyone in this room would agree is memory, that is sensory, that is nearly immediate, and there is good evidence across many lines of inquiry within science, many different fields, that we are constantly taking in information across nearly every sense and immediately discarding almost all of it. And this explains in part the sense that in times of great stress and times of intensity, time appears to slow down. And that sense of, good Lord, that sense of time slowing down is actually about us effectively increasing the frame rate, be it visual or one of the other senses, such that we have more information for a given unit of time than we normally do. Because, just to give a mundane example, when I first walked in here yesterday, I was taking in much more of what is in the room than I walked in today. Yesterday it was my first time ever in this space, and today it's my second time. And unless something was different, the couches, I didn't notice as much today as I did yesterday because they haven't changed. We notice things when they change, but it's not that we aren't taking them in, it's that we are immediately editing them out. So the information comes in and then the editing out happens, and our frontal lobes, our conscious brains, are never at all aware. Are those thoughts? They're senses. They are real in the sense that we did perceive them and they went through the processing part of our brain and then they got deleted. I don't know if those are thoughts or not. And they were remembered briefly and then edited. So all of that is true, but I don't know where I would draw the line about where the thoughts are or are not.
Hedda, could you keep the microphone? I just want to ask you something, because this morning I didn't have a chance, and it's around the area of memory, and if there's some kind of evolution of memory, but also actually more something in the area of emotion also, because if I, and then I, when I, so subjectively, how I experience myself and my emotions is, okay, there is a particular incident happens and I feel hurt, upset, or jealous, but it's almost like the pattern of that emotion is there, like the pattern jealousy, and it's you know, and then a particular word then triggers, yeah, now I'm jealous, or now I am scared, or now I'm hurt. You see, the entity almost exists without a particular trigger. And I was just wondering how, and that's what I somehow think that's a kind of blueprint that every human being, so I guess that's how evolution has brought us to here, has formed in us. And so has there been any study being done on that level of how, and this not only with humans, because, you know, I mean, animal can be hurt, feel hurt or embarrassed, you know, a dog can look embarrassed, or so I was just wondering how that, if there's more on that. So that's one part of the question. But I put something together, and then you can. So that's one. I'm curious about that. Then, like, I can. So okay. So how I feel like for evolution to find and when I read evolution and when I hear you talking about the various aspects of evolution, it's never ending, right? There's so many aspects to it. It's always something else that's uprooted and helps you to explain something. But it explains somehow what we are as creature or something, and many things that we attribute that something that I chose to do, then turns out actually there are many there's actually a whole pattern, that the evolutionary programming that we're acting out somehow. Now, so that's one bit, and then the second bit, and that came out this morning, of course, also, and is so if you would okay, so maybe put it this way, like there's somehow a hypothesis here, or maybe a belief system that could be on top, that actually the human being can or could or should be able to, especially in the religious tradition, to be free. That's the possibility that the human being, and then look at Buddha, Krishnamurti, and then I have 5 other ones, Christian mystics, etc. That there's somehow in the human potentiality, if all these anecdotal evidence is true and what they were saying was really true, was correct, that there's something in the human potentiality of freedom, which means detachment from non-attachment, or a direct perception, something on those lines. Now, I don't know where I wanted to go with this, but somehow, and that is related to that's related to how, yeah, how do I say that?
May I try to answer your first question
okay,
first?
yeah, good. Okay.
If I remember correctly, I think you were getting at the apparent maybe universality, and maybe even just existing outside of the experience of, you know, this brought me to anger, but anger seems to be something that arrived on its own, right? I'm reminded, this is a little bit of a feint, I'm kind of avoiding the question here, but what that reminded me of was a hypothesis in linguistics called the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, which is generally understood by linguists, I think, to likely have some truth in its weak form. And basically what it argues is that our language creates our thoughts. Now, perhaps we have to define thought to pursue that, but the idea being that, for instance, there are languages out there, there are cultures out there that only have a few words for colors and don't have all the words for colors that we do. And it's not that those colors don't have objective reality outside of our perception of them, but growing up using a language where you don't have word for purple, for instance, when you see something that's intermediate between blue and red, you identify it as blue or red, and you do not end up thinking, wait, I'm missing a concept for this. Some people will, but most people using that language don't. And so the idea is, in various forms, that the language that you grow up using actually does constrain what it is that you can think of the world. And so your perceptions themselves are mitigated by the symbolic structure of speech and of math and of the other symbolic structures that we have. I don't know, and I've never seen an anthropological investigation of the universality of things like anger. I would be shocked if anger wasn't universal, if jealousy wasn't universal. I'm certain that love is, as a different kind of thing, and sadness. I assume that these are universal, but I imagine that the way that we experience them is actually equally informed by our developmental environment and perhaps even by the language that we have around them, as are things like our understanding of color and weather and the particular metaphors we use to describe position and time and temperature and such. So what does it mean for those concepts to seem to arrive unbidden? I know what this is. I'm angry. I'm not sure, but I think it's maybe the flip side of that is, I'll bet, I know I have, that everyone in here has had an experience of doing something and remembering, wait, right, this is something that I do. This is a pattern that I have, and every time I do it, I'm halfway through it before I recognize that I do this thing. And how is it that my brain erased the memory of this pattern until I was already halfway into it? Is it really that unuseful to be aware of going into some, trivial little pattern or not? And I think this gets back to this idea of so much of what we are is hidden from us, hidden from our consciousness, and the efforts in many, many traditions throughout human history to bring more things to consciousness are admirable, for sure, but we should understand that there's no chance of bringing everything to consciousness, and that some things are hidden maybe for good reason, that hiding things from ourselves, like I was talking about yesterday, in one half of the brain even, in the left brain versus the right brain, such that the other half can't access it and doesn't have some information while it's processing, can lead to greater creativity and insight. It may be exactly hiding things from yourself, neurologically, intellectually, in space, can create the conditions wherein we can have insight. I'm not sure I answered, but you want to try your second question now?
Not so much about answering. I mean, I'm just throwing something in that direction because I feel that seems to be the most of a very important part of being human, and then how it works as human, and how So that's I was just wondering if there was any, from an evolutionary perspective, you might have said, there's so much study done on it, and this is how it was in the early humans, and then it's developed like this, and then
Well, one thing I will add, just to bring in the non-human, component is, sure, definitely there are things that we see other socially complex animals do that we recognize as that was anger, that was jealousy. We have no idea what their framework for that is, what they call it. Do they call it anything? Does a baboon call it anything when another baboon takes her baby to herself, or does she simply have the experience and proceed with her action, but also categorize it and remember never to get near that other baboon again? Or is there some kind of symbolic representation in her head around what that was and what combination of anger and jealousy it was? This we can't know. We can know more about humans because we can ask them, and we can know less about humans because we can ask them, because we lie. We lie all the time, whether or not we mean to or not.
We lie, or we just don't know really what's happening, right? So we just say something.
There are there are a lot of things that are popping off in my brain as I'm hearing different people speak. One was the term coding, to talk about the biological history. That literally DNA is a form of coding, biological coding. And maybe that's a way to differentiate it from psychological emotional memory. Another was a question that came up earlier, which I'll kind of get to towards the end. An experience about emotions, how they're identified. Is there a universal identifier for anger, for sadness? I'm not a scientist, so I'm not very good at qualifying or quantifying my data, but I am a storyteller, so I remember narrative. Some of the narrative that I'm remembering is of the imprinting of memory with emotion, and that moment of slowing down the frame rate, and moments of crisis, whether they're physical trauma, emotional trauma, what have you, where we take in from all of our senses at the same time and remember, or much more than we would in a normal environment. And we record and keep all of that. I had read a story of a woman who had grown up in a traumatic environment, psychologically traumatic environment, where she did not experience emotion. And I know that this has happened in other cases. This is not an uncommon experience. And had to go through a kind of therapeutic process where she was taught to recognize emotion through the physical sensations that she was experiencing in her body. So that emotions were not necessarily a thought process. Emotions were like a motor-sensorial, bodily cognitive process. And I think that is probably what happens to us when we're learning to identify our emotions when we're young. Developmental identification of emotions. I'm having this physiological process. I'm having these sensations in my body. This is anger. Tears are sadness. These kinds of physical experiences that we then categorize in an abstract idea of what the emotion is, and how that then relates to memory. I'm going to kind of jump to a personal experience, which is an experience of physical trauma that I had, where my memory was completely lost. Due to a severe physical trauma, there were 3 days where I have no memory. But there is no, I didn't remember the period of time for a very good reason. And also that when I did emerge back into waking consciousness, so to speak, there was no emotional state of fear, anxiety about not having had that memory. So somewhere in my body that memory is recorded. It's just not accessible to my conscious mind, nor do I have any need to make it accessible to my conscious mind. So there is somatic memory, but it's not necessarily always necessary for it to become mental or psychological memory, even in correlating it to an emotion. The last thing that I have been thinking since the question or the discussion or exploration process this morning was the comments that you made about the complexity of consciousness as it relates to the identification or experience of love. And that the more complex the manifestation of consciousness, whether it's physiological, psychological, the more likely we observe that or identify what we would describe as love. So, not to suggest that there's an exact correlation here, but then I wonder if that does, for me, that at least gives rise to the question, as our consciousness evolves, do we then, is there then some correlation to that and the expansion of our perception of love?
I can't respond to that directly. Can we just let that stay by itself? Okay. So to come back a little bit to some of the other comments that have been made in the last 15 or 20 minutes, I have a little bit the impression that in talking about what is thought and what is not thought, it seems as though we're trying to get a pretty precise boundary. And so we want to know, well, do animals have thought? And, well, is the memory in DNA? How do you distinguish that? And is there such a thing as a immediate sensory thought? And is there some things which are hidden forms of thought? And, these are certainly all valid questions, but it would seem to me that they are secondary questions, because the primary question, the primary issue is there are certain things which are clearly thought, and there's no doubt about it. The word is a form of thought. The word elephant is a form of thought. The concept of elephant is a form of thought. The word is not the thing. And it's clear that the word elephant is not an elephant, but in some other contexts, it's not so clear-cut that the word is not the thing, because the word anger, it's in some strange way bleeds over into the experience of anger, similarly with fear and so on. But my point is that there are certain areas where we don't have to wonder or worry whether or not this falls in the category of thought. It's clearly thought. And one of those areas is, as we were discussing yesterday morning, the images that we form of people and the manner in which those images interfere with our relationship and create conflict. So it seems to me that if we could just, relegate to a secondary level the question of, well, what exactly falls within the boundary of thought and what does not, and remember that the primary thing is there are certain things which we know are thought and which we know are dysfunctional in the way we live, and if we could learn to cope with thought at that level, then maybe we would have some energy left over to think about, well, does my dog have thought, and is that important, and so on and so forth.
I started in the beginning, in the second part of the question, and I still don't have it formulated, but I just want to give it another go. Because my starting point is, so what do we expect, or what do you think is needed for the society to become a just and fair society? What needs to happen with human beings? Or maybe nothing needs to happen. That's also the possibility. And are we making assumptions along the way that we say, well, how we are functioning at the moment, how we are operating at the moment, is actually sufficient to solve the climate crisis, is sufficient to create the kind of society that we want, and that's that's good enough. We just have to, So what is the next step? The next step might be just to have the United Nations have to meet more, or the American government has to participate in the Paris Agreement. Is it on that level that the human that we as humanity are going to make a leap, or is a leap not necessary? It just has to be a little bit more. A little bit more. Some small things have to be in place. So, and I think so. So that's maybe and that's maybe we have to be clear that at least from my point of view, and that's what I also understand from Krishnamurti's point of view, is that somehow a discontinuity is needed. That somehow, as long as there's identification with a nation state, not that it's a problem to have an American passport or a Dutch passport, as I have. But that the emotional identification with it has a problem, and and there's a whole series of concepts, identification, religion, this and that, all those kind of things. Now, what would if a change is needed? So we can disagree about that. Maybe we say, well, the same human being as sitting here are going to create a peaceful society, or some kind of discontinuity is needed in order for that peaceful society to bring about. It's not just sufficient to carry on as we go with. Now then, the second question, and that's why I am because this morning we looked at capacity and how is capacity developed. Now is the human brain, as it is now, is it already sufficient? Or does something structurally has to change, so there has to be some more steps in evolution have to be taken in order to have the brain that can meet the challenges of the current times? Or maybe that's not needed. I mean, at least Krishnamurti seems to be suggesting that actually the human species as it is now, evolved as it is now, has all the capacity to somehow solve it. But some kind of step has to be made, which is not necessarily evolutionary. But so for me, it's actually interesting to see actually what has evolution done, because because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. If we don't understand that properly, we say, well, because we cannot change that, and it has to be understood. And that's also why it's important, because there are certain evolution we are a product of evolution, and that means that there are certain features, possibilities and impossibilities, certain limitations on what we can function, and whatever the solution is, it has to be within those parameters. So it's actually fun and interesting to look at that. Now, and so now there's some hope or some encouragement that the human brain is capable of doing that. And why am I saying that? Because there's these narratives, at least, of Krishnamurti, of Buddha, who at least seem to be claiming that there's some change possible within the brain, and it doesn't need a brain operation. It's not a lobotomy. It's not drugs that have to do it. There seems to be a potentiality now. So, and that I feel is more of the where I'm curious about what is that, and how does that fit in with the human potentiality, and I would also be interesting, but I'm not want to single you out, but if there's something in evolution that would be interesting to contribute to this, I would love to hear that. Yeah. So yeah.
I'll take on the second part of that question, which is easier. Which is, does something structurally need to change in our brains, or do we have what we need already? And I think the false dichotomy that you then added, which I didn't in my restating of the question, was the first thing would be evolutionary, the second thing wouldn't. And my take, my fundamental assumption, which I've been very forthright about here, is that it's all evolutionary. That whether or not it's anatomical or physiological or neurological, or call all of that hardware for the moment, or at the software level, culture and learning and symbol and those things and behavior, that all of the things on the software level are also both evolutionary, and as humans, we have a higher ratio of software to hardware that makes us what we are than any other organism on the planet. That it's not a discrete change. there are many things that make us distinct from all the other organisms, but most of them are continuing, not all of them. We're bipedal. There are some distinct changes around language, around laryngeal anatomy and such. But so many of the things that we've been talking about here around consciousness and symbolic, even symbolic manipulation and tool use and war and all of this are continua. So do we have what we need on board already, or will it require hardware level evolution? I don't think we need to worry about it requiring hardware level evolution, but we are constantly engaged in software level evolution. That's what I mean, and that's the advantage of software level evolution, is it can happen so much faster. It doesn't take a generation switch. It doesn't take sexual reproduction to change. And as a result, we can have humans where they're incredibly not just long lifespans, but also long generation time, where 20, 25 years, and yet our culture changes ever faster, demonstrating that these changes can happen very, very quickly. But I think what we need to do is think with intention around what the changes are that we need. Do we have the capacity to do it? Yes. Will we pull it off? I don't know.
But what makes you say yes? Is that hope? Is that just longing? Or is it, is it just the saying no is actually, you know what I mean?
There are a few things at the base of that, and I'm not sure I've laid the sufficient groundwork for me to explain it in terms that. Do you want to try it, Pathik?
So what I'll ask you is just give 3 or 4 criteria for what maybe the Buddha said is possible, or Krishnamurti, or anybody else. Just give, instead of just saying as we know from the Buddha or as we know from Krishnamurti, just say 3 or 4 things, and then I'll try to answer your question about whether it's possible or not today.
Well, I might not take up your invitation to do it that way, but I will respond partially. In what I understand, that there's something in our humanness that has the potentiality to have a different relationship with attachment, for example, and with identification, attachment. And that might not necessarily be that the mechanical response, the response in the brain of attachment will not occur, but that they seem to be suggesting that there can be a freedom from that. Not that it's not happening, because it seems to be, but that there's somehow a freedom, and the freedom seems to be equal with knowing or seeing in the moment, not but there seems to be something in the moment that has the potentiality for a different quality or a different relationship with it. That's the main thing. Yeah.
So one way that this could happen, and perhaps does happen quite a bit, is the following 2 steps. One, as we've discussed many times, there's a lot of variation in any trait. So take some people who are at the extreme end for having a temporal lobe that's very sensitive to minor fluctuations in electrical activity that could be induced by diet, weather, lots of things. Now you couple that, and it only exists in some people, right? Not the whole human population. That extreme. All humans, the temporal lobe is, as every lobe is responsive to electrical activity, but the sensitivity is very high there. Something happens that does that, and then through things that we understand fairly clearly, there's a sensation of total oneness with everything. There is no differential attachment. You either say you're detached because you're just one with everything, or you say you feel equal affection for the flower and the tree and everything around you and every person around you. So that's step 1. And then step 2, this is a very weird experience I'm having. What on earth is this? And then, I build a narrative because I want to tell you about it. And so then I make up a narrative that, this is what attachment does, and try it and you lose it or something. Or I say, I'm going crazy, whatever. Those vary as well. But what would be the difference in this kind of scenario, which is completely mechanical, which hasn't dealt with the problems you were interested in, but has someone sitting here saying they dealt with, and actually behaves like that, then doesn't, favor him over him, or although he's been my friend for a long time, I don't know him, because it's so genuine, that sense of either super attachment to everything or the same, which is like total detachment. And that's not what you're asking about. But how would you tell the difference? So what kind of question are you asking in that? And if that's not what you're asking about, I'm assuming that's not what you're asking about, then you got to do the work to come up with a better question, because what you asked, I can tell you as with high degree of confidence that it can be done and is routinely happening.
The question is the question is what kind of mind, or what is needed for our human species to meet the crisis that we're facing, where Hedda says, well, maybe some change has to happen in 30 years. Will the current mindset do it, or is some kind of discontinuity or some kind of shift or some kind of change needed in order to do it? No, because no, I'm not gonna. So that's my question. So now I know what I've told you, what an element of what I think, or what I understand the Buddha was talking about. I also what I maybe try to say what I think where Krishnamurti was talking about, and that there's certain aspects of maybe that are, but the aspects, of course, the proof of the pudding is if there's a different human being who can respond differently to life in a live way, in an intelligent way, and in unhampered by the limitations.
Yeah. So remember that the Buddha or Krishnamurti never were able to establish that this can happen to humanity. They just say, well, it happened to me and therefore it can happen to anyone. But nobody ever has shown that. So you change your question, because initially you said, can it, what will it take in a person, although you didn't say in a person part, but then you said for all of humanity later.
Yeah, I mean, to refine that question, I mean, on the similar grounds, what I observed is human experience suffering. That's what I think even Buddha mentioned is inevitable. Every human experience the pain. So the question is, how do we, because of this intelligence or like this research or this science, how could we avoid that? Is there anything that a person can do or practice to avoid, because the suffering you can see in every relationship, you have a conflict, you see that, and you go through that pain, and we understand that. So now, what is that we can do about it? Is it on the same grounds?
Yeah, I don't know if it's I think it's in that line, according to along those lines. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So then, where?
Well,
5 more minutes, and then we're. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to raise another question, which is, something that I think I'm not that familiar with Buddhism, but certainly with Krishnamurti, there's, it's not just merely that if we all live in the present moment that the world transform, but there's also that it requires a lot of attention, a lot of an ability to look at judgments and opinions and attachments, all these kinds of things, which I wonder, from a biological perspective, if there's anything, because we understand habits on a certain level neurologically that, there's at least some understanding how they occur, and that we're able to eliminate them. So I guess my question would just be, does anybody see a barrier from a biological perspective why these types of thinking would be any different from a habit like smoking or anything like that?
About regulation, that somehow material regulation is very, you can quantify it. You can say, okay, we are producing more and giving more resource, or spending more resources that we are actually having when we have the numbers, and we can actually say, okay, we stop it, we have statistics, data, and so on. And my question is there any internal biological, I don't know which word to use, mental regulation that we have to do in order to stop suffering, or in order to not solve this crisis, but approach it in any way. So.
And I believe that that's connected very much in the full circle of things with thought and language, and our discussion of how we can control the thoughts within ourselves.
Okay. Good. See you all tomorrow. 9:30.